Hello, everybody. My name is Mike Azarin, and I'm joined by Grace Lindsay. Grace, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Grace Lindsay. I'm a professor of psychology and data science at New York University.
So, how would you explain what your research is to somebody who's unfamiliar with neuroscience and psychology in general?
Yes, so I fall into the domain of a computational neuroscientist. So I use computational models to study the brain. I don't actually do, my lab doesn't do experiments. We rely on data that is collected by other labs to inform how we build our models. But the idea is that, there is a data out there about how the brain works. We've collected data on neural activity and, behavior. And the goal of the type of modeling that I do is to be able to connect those things and say, okay, this is some idea of how neural activity gives rise to intelligent behavior. And I do that particularly using artificial neural networks, which are popular these days because of the role they play in AI. But they're inspired by how the brain works, how neurons in the brain work. And so we use them as kind of a stand-in for the brain, kind of create this, some people call it like in silico electrophysiology or something like that. And you're using this computational model as a stand-in for the brain, and you can kind of do some of the same experiments you might do on a brain, or take inspiration from how the brain works in terms of how you build your model and then compare it against the behavior that you're trying to replicate and to understand.
Interesting stuff. And I recently saw they made like a model of I don't know how recent it was, but like they made a model of a fruit fly brain.
Mhm.
And this raises like tons of questions, obviously, like ethical questions and questions about consciousness. But before we get into that, how far away do you think we are of getting like a full model of the brain into a computer? I mean, is such a thing even like possible? Or what are like the technical limitations, I guess?
Yeah, there's a few different considerations there. So, one is on what level of detail do you want to model the brain? And I mean, the brain is made up of neurons. Neurons are made up of proteins, which are made up of molecules. And, you could go all the way down. You could have like an atom based model of the brain. That would be very difficult because that would be a lot to simulate. We don't have the compute power to simulate that. We also don't have the ability to collect data from an individual brain at that level of detail. So, for example, things like this demonstration of a simulated fly that relies on data from a fly brain to kind of build that simulation. Even that data, it's mostly the connectome data, which is a set of how neurons are connected to each other in the brain. That data is not a complete description of the fly brain. There are still tons of things that we don't know, even if we have the connectome of a brain. And getting that connectome for a single fly was a lot of work. So a human brain, which is obviously much larger, the challenges in even getting something like the connectome, it's a huge kind of experimental and computational challenge. And even then, you wouldn't have sufficient data to actually replicate the full brain. So there's a question of, what level of resolution, the more detailed you go, the more compute power it would take and the more data you would need to build the model. Yeah, there's that question of how do you get that data in the first place to do that kind of simulation. So on both of those metrics, we're kind of pretty far off from a full human brain simulated in a computer.
What kinds of things can the connectome account for versus like what does it not account for?
Yeah. So usually when people have connectome data, a lot of the time it would be binary connectome data, which just means that for any pair of neurons in the brain, it just says, are these neurons connected or not? And so that doesn't tell you the strength of the connection, how strongly one neuron influences the other. It just tells you that there is a connection. It also doesn't tell you things like or it doesn't necessarily, the most basic kind of binary connectome wouldn't tell you what kind of cell it is, the properties of that cell, how it turns its inputs into outputs, if there's any um, kind of within cell information processing happening. It kind of treats the neurons as kind of a single point and then describes their connections. So the basic binary connectome lacks a lot of other detail. You can sometimes get some of that detail when you're getting the connectome, but there's basically always things that you're lacking. You're lacking genetic profiles of the individual cells. You're lacking certain details about what's happening at the synapse and what proteins and receptors exist there. There's just always more things that you're missing, and also a lot of times those connectomes ignore other parts of the brain. For example, if there are glial cells, astrocytes, that we don't really fully understand the functional role of those in information processing, and those are kind of left out of connectomes entirely usually. Yeah, all of that kind of stuff. It doesn't help you understand if there's any extracellular communication happening. All of those things can be lacking from a connectome.
What specifically are we missing about glial cells? I did not know we didn't know because I took like a neurobiology class this summer, and maybe it was just like an oversimplified explanation, but it was like glial cells are like support cells, and they're like a what like 80% of the brain or something like that.
Yeah, so the support cell concept is like kind of the first pass dominant description, and so they're thought of more like people who are thinking about diseases of the brain and neuroinflammation might care about glial cells because they're really thought of as this like physical thing of like supporting the physical nature of the brain. However, there is increasing research that suggests that they might have some sort of role in information integration, because they kind of a single cell can touch a bunch of other neurons, and they have some ability to do some electrical signal processing. So it's kind of it's open, and also a role in plasticity. I think is another one. This isn't. I like most of neuroscience. I also ignore these cells, the glial cells and the astrocytes and everything. But yeah, I know peripherally that there are studies that are suggesting that they may play more of a role in kind of the functional information processing side of what neurons do than maybe we previously accepted.
Hmm. And so back to the connectome thing, by the way. So like I'm thinking about you said that it would represent like connected as zero and like or unconnected as zero and like connected as one. Maybe like if you wanted to represent like the strength of the connection, you could represent it as a number between zero and one. And then like how could you go about like computing like what does it even mean for to measure like how strong a connection is between like two neurons?
Yeah, so this, goes to this idea of, okay, you want to simulate a brain. Well, what level of detail do you simulate it in? So if you have a synapse, a connection between two neurons, the way that strength manifests physically is sometimes it's in the number of receptors for the neurotransmitter on the postsynaptic cell. So, the cell that's picking up the signal, how sensitive is that to how many receptors does it have? There's also the presynaptic cell, which is releasing the neurotransmitter. There's how many vesicles does that have, and how many neurotransmitters are in each vesicle. There's kind of the probability of release. It could be have a bunch of vesicles stored, but not a lot of them don't go and actually release when the cell is firing. So there are these physical things that influence what we would call the strength of the connection. But yeah, when you're modeling, you have to kind of collapse that to a number. And yeah, so a lot of times you would think about these numbers as maybe being defined relative to each other. So, there's some neuron that's a super strong connection, and another one is, some fraction of that or something like that. Because technically, when you're building these models, the units can be kind of arbitrary because you could just scale all of the strengths up or down, and you'd have the same impact if you're just kind of summing up the inputs. Yeah, so it's an abstract notion, and you just kind of have to settle on some scale that you care about and then define things on that scale.
Interesting. Is the brain fundamentally a deterministic or probabilistic thing? What
We think of it basically as probabilistic. There's enough uncertainty that it's reasonable. I mean, we know that you can show you can show an animal the same stimulus or have it produce the same movement over and over, and you can record from neurons that seem to be involved in that process, and they won't have the exact same firing patterns every single time that you're doing the same thing. Um, it's a, so some of this is kind of a philosophical issue of what you call noise or probability or stochasticity. Um, a lot of what we call noise is just the signal that we don't understand yet. So,
Mm.
I'm studying this animal and I'm telling it to make this arm movement. And every time it makes this arm movement, its neurons fire slightly differently. I could say, oh, it's so noisy. Or I could say, well, every time it did it, it was slightly different. It had learned maybe from the past time it did it, or like the lighting changed slightly, or, whatever it is, or it got a little bit more hungry and distracted from the task or whatever. So there, to some extent, there is stochasticity due to a bunch of other stuff happening in the brain that we don't understand. But then there will be, you know, naturally stochastic kind of processes, on this cellular or subcellular level that will impact the firing of neurons as well.
How does this tie into like free will? Like, do you think we have free will? If there is like biological noise, because I feel like on like prima facie, you would look at that and say like, okay, um, if we lived in like a deterministic world where like the brain's outputs were like completely determined by like one action potential, then it's very easy to say, yeah, there's no way that's we have free will because everything cause a cause and you have no like stake in it. If it's probabilistic though, I mean, it still feels like there's no free will. What do you think?
Yeah. So it is tempting. A lot of people do, when they hear about this idea of the brain being kind of probabilistic, they do instinctively want to say that that somehow can be a mechanism of free will. But as you say, it doesn't, being random isn't really will either. If it's like in a deterministic sense, it's not free. And if it's random, it's not will. So in both cases, we don't have free will. I think a thing to kind of think about is, when we talk about free will, it's like, what are we saying? You're saying like, I have free will. I have the ability to choose what I do. Um, so the concept of I doesn't exist on a neuron level. There is no I in an individual neuron. Your sense of self is a kind of emergent property of your brain. And so it doesn't make sense to think about the neuron level when we're talking about free will. Like whether neurons are stochastic or deterministic isn't the relevant thing to think about for thinking about if you have free will, if you have that sense of being able to have done otherwise, because it's just two completely different levels of description of the system. So I think, for all practical purposes where it matters to be discussing the concept of free will, we have free will. You have the ability to think about what you want to do and make a decision, and you have to make decisions about what you want to do. Whether or not the machinery that somehow leads to that sensation of decision making is deterministic or stochastic, it doesn't really matter for any practical implication of free will. That's my take on it.
Interesting. What was that experiment where the guy showed that like some it starts with his name starts with an L that like decisions are made like 200 milliseconds
Yeah.
before.
Libet, Libert, something. Uh, yeah, one of those. Um, yeah, there's these kind of style of studies where you can kind of tell people to make volitional movements, and then they'll report, just deciding to make that movement, and then they'll make the movement, and then you can look in their neural activity and say, oh, well, I could have predicted that you were going to make that decision in advance. Um, that to me is kind of trivially obvious. Where else would the sensation that you want to move come from? Like, I guess, yeah, you either believe that the brain is the cause of, how we generate actions, and, reporting that you want to make a decision is an action. And so obviously some part of your brain has to have started accumulating evidence in favor of making that decision and taking that action in advance. Otherwise, it would just kind of be like a lightning bolt from nowhere. So yeah, so those kinds of things don't strike me as, again, super
You just
relevant if you just
cut
accept the
out.
fact that we
You're
are
frozen.
brains. Oh, no.
Oh, you're back.
Okay. Sorry. Yeah, so the idea that you can find in the brain a signal of an upcoming decision before the person reports it, I just don't know how it could be otherwise. So, I mean, it maybe feels unsettling, but yeah, everything you do, it comes from your brain, essentially.
Yeah, I would suspect that the thinking is like you said, there's like the two levels of description at the neuron level, and then at like the if we take like I guess the idea of like a self, right? There's the emergent like self, and then there's like neurons firing. And I think people maybe have this intuition that, like, okay, it's the emergent self
Mhm.
that's making the decision
Mhm.
and then communicating that decision back to the physical layer when in
Right.
reality maybe it's the physical layer making the decision.
Well, there is only the physical layer. This is
Hmm.
like just to talk about the physical layer and the emergent self. This is like, mind body dualism, and it's not really a coherent theory from my perspective. There is only the physical layer, and it can create very emergent, like very complex emergent behaviors like us talking about the concept of self. But it does all of this has to be able to be boiled down to what neurons are doing at some point. And it's hard, like it obviously it doesn't feel that way. And really,
Yeah.
I mean, what a lot of this boils down to is like consciousness and the fact that it feels like you are a thing making a decision, and that seems incompatible with it just being a bunch of neurons. If we talked about this just as a computer simulation, if I said I simulated a model and the model chose to make a movement at some point, and I could predict before the model made the movement that it was going to make the movement and be like, sure, why, like how else could it have made the movement? You built a model that decides to move at some point, you're going to be able to see in its activity, that ramp up to that decision. That's not crazy. It's really only because of whatever consciousness is that we get kind of caught up in this confusion of thinking about free will. If you just accept that we kind of feel like something, then the fact that it feels like something to make a decision is not, it's not a complicated thing on top of it.
But so then why couldn't it be that like there is just like okay, like like you said, like a computer model, right? Does it feel like something to be a computer model?
I don't know.
Yeah, me neither. But
Yeah.
like, so I mean, surely it probably feels like something to be you, I would suspect. Um, but
Technically, we only know for ourselves. But yes, I also assume that it feels like something to be you. But
like, I have no
technically,
reason to like Occam's razor. I have no reason to
mhm,
believe that it wouldn't feel like something to be
mhm,
you
yeah.
because we have the same like somewhat similar neural architecture.
Mhm.
Um, but why couldn't it just feel like be like a, let's say let's suppose that a computer simulation doesn't have like what does it feel like to be a computer simulation? Why couldn't it just be like neurons doing stuff and that doesn't feel like anything?
We don't know. So like the question, so yeah, um, people obviously people want to make progress on trying to understand consciousness, and so they kind of just come in and make some assertions to be able to make progress. So we make assertions like, well, the brain is the seat of consciousness, and so there must be something about neural activity that is what creates consciousness, and therefore other things that have similarly complex nervous systems probably also have consciousness. And it's like, fine, that's a reasonable place to start. There are some people who think that consciousness is a result of the computations done by the brain, and therefore anything that does those computations could have the same consciousness, versus some people who believe that it's something about the physical matter that is important and not just the abstract computations. From my perspective, there is no scientific way to test those different hypotheses because we have no objective measure of consciousness. We measure consciousness via what people report, what they're able to, see or distinguish or not. We have clever ways of trying to probe the edges of this kind of, do people consciously report experiencing things and all of that. But those are all indirect measures of what we think that we actually care about. And what we actually care about is something that only we can only experience firsthand individually. So it's the way, at least the framework for which, we think about this now puts consciousness outside the realm of scientific inquiry. And that's it's unsatisfying. Um,
Yeah.
but and it could be the type of thing that in 100 years we just have a completely different way of thinking about everything that resolves what feels like an unresolvable problem. That's happened in the history of science. People were very, confused about how to think about the concept of life. How do things kind of have this animacy to them. And we eventually kind of resolved that. I was like, well, it's physics and it's chemistry, and you put stuff together and it can move, and like, fine. So, maybe something similar can happen with this idea of consciousness. But from my perspective, right now, with the way that we kind of divide up concepts and think about things, it's just something that can't be directly measured. And so it's really hard to make progress on it.
That's so sad.
I know.
D- you mentioned computability. Do you think that and I had a interview with Scott Aronson where I asked him if the brain is a computer. Do you think that I mean, could you upload the brain to a computer in all of its detail? Would that thing be conscious if it was in a computer?
I don't know. Um, do I I'm somehow inclined to say no, but I don't have any good reason for that. Um, yeah, no. Yeah. I my technical answer is that I have no ability to make a hypothesis about that because I don't have any data to base it on.
Can we talk about the self as an emergent property?
Practically, yes. Yeah. I mean, so it also depends. Some people have very heavy notions attached to the idea of emergence. To me, the idea of emergence is, we have something that we can study at different scales, and practically, it's easier to kind of draw a line between those scales, like within psychology and neuroscience. I would say those things are technically studying the same thing. They're studying, behavior as it emerges from nervous systems primarily. Um, but they study it at different levels, and it is conceptually easier to be able to talk about like the mind and talk about kind of patterns of human behavior and latent, potentially kind of latent causes, that can describe human behavior in a more compact way. Um, and then also we can separately then ask, where are those things implemented in the brain? How do they relate to neural activity? But you can get a decent, way in progress without thinking about the implementation in the brain and just finding better ways of describing human behavior. And so I think it's fine to draw that line because it's practically necessary. We can't start from atoms and explain human psychology. So we draw these lines and we come up with new terms and new concepts at each separation, even though we know technically we should be able to completely connect them if we really understood everything. That's my take on emergence.
What is emergence?
So, I mean, some people think emergence is like an irreducible change in levels. Like you have a low level system, something that's happening, and then at some scale, it shifts to have kind of completely different properties that you won't be able to explain with the low level description. I don't subscribe to that kind of hard emergence of there's a fundamental divide and you can't cross those lines. I think a big, goal and success of science has been being able to say how higher level properties emerge from low level properties and making those connections. And so it's possible. It's just very difficult in most circumstances.
Yeah, I always thought when people say okay, hydrogen is this gas and oxygen is this gas and you put them together and you get water. And it's but water has completely different properties than oxygen and hydrogen. I always thought that was so stupid because not stupid, but I thought it was so silly because okay, if I have a water bottle and a cap as two different objects, these things have completely different properties. And then if wait, hold on. Sorry, I need to stay hydrated. And then I put the cap on the water bottle. Obviously, the water bottle cap system will now have completely different properties because they the geometry changed and
Hmm.
the geometry is what determines how its shape changed and how it's
Hmm.
shaped determines how it functions.
So yeah, and you can explain why when put the two things together, it's you can say that like kind of the whole is more than the sum of its parts, but it's also explainable from the sum of its parts.
Yeah.
And so yeah, I think that kind of is a little bit, people mean different things when they say emergence, but there is this kind of more hard emergence idea, which is saying, the properties that you describe at the lower level are not going to be sufficient to explain the properties at the higher level. And sometimes they mean it like you wouldn't use the same concepts in both levels. But sometimes I think people mean it as you can't use the lower level properties to get to the higher level properties. And that more strict version where you can't cross that divide, I don't think is true, but I think it's practically hard to cross that divide so often in science that that's why we kind of de facto have these divides.
Yeah, agreed. Um, do you wait, so what is the self?
The self.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, it's yeah. I mean, people, so within psychology, people can study this idea of the sense of self, and people can talk about having experiences where they lose their sense of self. But it's the idea that there is a point of view that you exist from, and you have these kinds of attached, identities and memories, and you are a coherent thing that moves through the world. Sometimes people will have experiences either through like meditation or drugs or something where they say like their sense of self dissolves and they feel like they're one with the universe. They don't feel like a separate entity that's interacting with the world. They just feel like part of the world. So the fact that we can kind of alter our brains in a way that makes that sense of self go away suggests that, there's something about neural activity that's generating that sense of self.
But like, can't we also alter our brain in such a way that our sense of hunger goes away? Like with like
Mhm.
stuff that, then why don't we say like, why don't we, I feel we refer to it very differently though.
Well, yeah, I mean, hunger is just kind of a more low level property, but yeah, it also, the sensation of that comes from interactions with neurons in the brain. And you can definitely alter. I mean, yeah, you can do all kinds of things to alter your sensation. I guess the sense of self people find more, I don't know, more fundamental because it kind of integrates a lot of things. And so maybe that makes it feel harder to explain in terms of the brain, whereas like hunger has very clear kind of separate neural pathways that it's
Mm.
kind of easier and more obvious to say like, yeah, you could shut that neuron off and you wouldn't feel the same way. The sense of self is like this more integrated thing.
Mm. So let's take like addiction, for example. Like, it feels like something to be addicted to something.
Mhm.
And so like, is that feeling of being like, let's say like addicted to alcohol, is that what is that feeling? Is it literally just the feeling of your neurons having like upregulated whatever GABA receptors, or is or downregulated? I don't know. I don't remember. But
Um, so yeah, I mean, I think, in something like addiction, the sensation itself is, probably most experienced as the sensation of wanting something, um, and being like very motivated to get that thing. And so that kind of cluster of feelings will maybe exist in a distributed way across the brain. I don't think that you can reduce it to, individual receptors or something like that. But again, it's not like there's a you and then the you is sensing something about your brain, right? It's like the you just is the result of the brain.
mm,
So so it wouldn't be like, oh, I can sense that this part of my brain is active and that's why I feel like I want something. It just is that part of the brain is active. And so you are going to engage in behaviors that get you the thing that you want. You're going to show an obvious desire for that thing. And so it's the result of the circuits themselves being kind of shifted into a different state, where they seek out this particular type of reward, um, that kind of is going to be the emergent effect of, or the way we could describe what addiction is.
so would it be accurate to say that let's say hunger, what is like the neural circuit for like hunger?
You're gonna make me remember back to introductory neuroscience courses
Sorry,
with
what's
like
like a
glucose
neural,
blood centers, and they go to the brainstem and subcortical areas and stuff like that.
so is the feeling of the, sorry, what was it? The
I think the hunger centers are in the brainstem and other subcortical areas, not so much in cortex.
Okay, so like is the feeling of like let's say I feel like oh man, I'm hungry and I become conscious of it. So that's probably what my brainstem communicated connecting with my prefrontal cortex or something.
Okay, so that assumes that for consciousness, it has to exist in your prefrontal cortex, but we don't know if that's true. Your sensation of hunger could simply be some lower level uh, activity. At least in the case of hunger, I don't know of what studies have been done to like really pinpoint. If we shut this down, does someone still feel hunger? If we shut that down, does someone still feel hunger? I don't know the full anatomy of that.
Hmm.
But it doesn't have to be the case that it gets to the prefrontal cortex necessarily.
Well, surely like I could be hungry, but I could not be conscious of my hunger. Like
Yeah, I mean, I think then we would say, yeah. So the hunger itself kind of has the connotation of being a sensation. It's not like you could be like your body could be lacking nutrients and you could not feel hunger. That's a separation that could happen.
yeah.
Yeah, in which case there'd be some, impact of the signaling of your body's cues about its need for nutrients that are not getting to your brain.
Yeah, like when I get really deep into like meditation, like I could feel my like digestive organs.
Mm.
It's really weird. Like I could feel myself like I could feel like my like organs and I don't know. And so maybe like I guess normally my brain is I really am so I really don't know like what how to describe it. It's such a weird thing. Like my brain is was it proprioception?
There's proprioception, which is like the sense of your body in space, and then there's interoception, the sense of the inside of your body.
Interoception. So like my brain has like this sense of like interoception, but I am not conscious of my own interoception until I get into a certain state.
Yeah. I think that could make sense because it's not usually the strongest signal that's going into your body. You're usually kind of going to be more driven by your visual environment, social interactions, that kind of thing. So if you've quieted all of that other stuff down, then that's a kind of all that remains in terms of outside sensations, usually.
Hmm. But like so then why wouldn't it be the case that like I like if we take hunger and like breathing and stuff, like when I go into manual breathe mode, and I'm sorry if I just triggered it for you by mentioning that. Um I I like to mess with my friends by saying like manual breathe mode activate and they get really mad.
Mhm,
And so like I would suspect that like the manual breathing is probably PFC and then like normal when you become conscious of your own breathing.
mhm.
Because like, what is like self if not like the modeling of the brain? But the brain is modeling the brain, so you're the brain modeling the brain, modeling the brain, modeling the brain.
Yeah, so people do connect this idea of self models to things like consciousness and to the sense of self that like there's part of your brain that is kind of modeling what the other parts of the brain are doing. And there are computational reasons why you would want that, like to do a good job of controlling a system. It's good to have a model of how that system works and you can use it to kind of predict what will happen next. So there are reasons aside from anything related to consciousness why a kind of well-designed system would have a model of its own components within it for the purposes of planning. And so areas like prefrontal cortex or other parts of frontal cortex and other kind of like association or higher order cortical areas, they are implicated in these ideas of like control of the brain or executive control. So kind of, if you have multiple different computations that your brain can do, there needs to be some controller that's saying, do this now, combine this with that, ungate this so that an output can be generated, that kind of stuff. So yeah, so there is a belief that these kinds of models of the brain exist within the brain to some extent, and can be used for control. And yeah, I don't know all the literature on like if you disrupt the circuits, responsible for that, what the exact behavioral or perceptual outcomes of that kind of thing are. But it is something that people have connected to the idea of consciousness, that maybe having a model within a model produces this kind of consciousness. But again, it's something that you could easily do in a computer simulation, and you could ask people if they actually think that that computer simulation is conscious. And I bet a lot of the people would say that they don't really necessarily believe that it is, even though it has this self monitoring. function.
Yeah. Like I was about, I was about to ask, like, why would we expect consciousness to emerge, or like a sense of I to emerge evolutionarily? But you stole my question, but it's okay because you're also the one answering it. So, um, I would, I was gonna say, like, let's say you have like a sufficiently, I guess, like a can of like, I don't know, like a wire system, like system of like wires or like electrical like poles and stuff, and that like, and somehow you're able to encode the system of electrical wires itself in the system of electrical wires. Like, or like, what are the things called? I don't even know. Like utility poles,
Mm.
and how there's like wires coming out of them. Sorry, I'm like kind of new to being human, so like, there's like utility poles and there's wires coming out of them,
Mm-hmm.
and then like those wires like somehow encoded in them are like models of the other utility poles. Why wouldn't that be conscious?
Yeah, so yeah, if you had, yeah, an electrical system that within the information that is carried in that electrical system, there was something that would be like a simulation of the system itself, um, you could ask that question of, is that sufficient for consciousness? And again, this goes back to the original problem in my mind, which is how do you test for it? Let's say your hypothesis is that that kind of system would have consciousness. What tests do you do to prove that it does or doesn't? A lot of the tests that we use are kind of specific to humans or other human-like entities where we can probe, did you see this or did you not see this? Do you remember this or not remember this? And we kind of use those as these indirect probes of consciousness. But something like consciousness could exist within a system that we can't probe in the same way. And so I don't know that there's, again, at this point in scientific history, a solution to what feels like a very fundamental problem here of not being able to measure it.
Or maybe, like you said, maybe science just isn't the right tool, which would be really sad. I hope that's the right tool.
Yeah, I mean, I guess from my mind, if there is a right tool, whatever it ends up to be, if it actually creates like objective understanding and progress in kind of controlling or building a system, we would call it science. Maybe it just means the exact type of science that we're doing right now is not suitable. But whatever means of understanding that allows us to make predictions and control a system and explain how a system works um, in a reliable way, it's probably something that we would call science once we get it to work.
But like, what's the difference between like science and philosophy?
So philosophy, I mean, yeah, it depends on what type of philosophy and where we are in the history of philosophy and science and all of that. I mean, I think now you would think of a divide between those two fields as being whether there's an empirical element to it or not. With philosophy not requiring that empirical element of, testing something in the real world, but more just being kind of a thought process, thinking about what is the best way to think about things. How should we divide up the world into concepts? Should we consider things to be in contradiction or, are two things that seem contradictory not actually in contradiction if we think about them in a different way? It's kind of, to my mind, the kind of most productive philosophy is one that lays out the right questions, kind of identifies what the right questions are, and gives frameworks for thinking about things that help us make progress on how we think about those things, helps kind of put words to concepts that matter or create in people's minds new concepts that will help them think about complex situations. But it's more this element of kind of the human interaction of, how should we think about the world? How should we think about our interactions with other people versus how does the world work? What is the description of the world that will give us an ability to control it?
I had this idea where like maybe all sciences start out as philosophies and then they become so, like computer science was like this like useless field of like subfield of a subfield of like logic, and then it became like a big thing. Or like even physics. I'm sure like before we had like, I don't know, like before they invented gravity, um they like everything would, they would just like think about like why is stuff falling down.
Yeah, no, and the historical term for scientists is natural philosophers. So people who philosophize about the natural world. eventually became scientists. But yeah, it definitely started out as a much more merged, there's just someone who wanted to think about the world. And yeah, maybe sometimes did a few tests to see if their thoughts were right. But it was more of a merged endeavor to start.
If you were alive, like in ancient Greek time, would you still would do you think you'd still be a scientist?
I don't know that
Ignoring
women
like
were
his
allowed to be scientists
Yeah,
then.
that's what that was
Let's
gonna be.
get that
I
aside.
figured
Yeah.
you would say that. Let's just say they make an exception for
Yeah,
you.
yeah, yeah. Um, I mean, it's very hard to think about. I mean, I don't know that there'd be something else I'd want. I mean, yeah, but I guess insofar as that wouldn't have been carved out as a thing to do in the same way, I think, the type of scientist that I am would probably manifest at that time as um, maybe more in the direction of like engineering or I don't know, I'm trying to think of like what was actually practically relevant at the time, like agriculture, like something where you're actually physically like you're doing things, but you're testing things out to see what works better. I think and then, you know, that was kind of separate from the people who were more like the mathematicians. And like the work I do now, you have to use math and computer science and computation to study the brain. But I think the kind of scientist that I am is one of like wanting to come up with hypotheses and testing them, which would probably, that's not what math was used for at that time, basically, from my understanding, my very not in depth understanding.
But isn't like because I want to go into computational neuroscience, I think. I don't know yet. But right now, that seems to be the most interesting thing to me. And my understanding of computational neuroscience is, and I guess the reason I wouldn't want to do, say, like behavioral neuroscience or stuff that involves like biochemistry. Or like I guess like literally like doing like dealing with like physical chemicals is because I'm just like not trying to do all that. Like and I mean that like genuinely like I really don't want to sit there with a micropipette for 6 hours and just like pour things into tubes. That sounds like torture. But like why I guess like why are you a computational neuroscientist and not like a different type of neuroscientist?
Yeah, so I started out as an experimental neuroscientist when I was
Sorry,
doing
I didn't mean to be offensive.
no, yeah, when I was doing my undergraduate degree, I worked in a few different labs that were experimental neuroscience labs. So I did experiments on animals, like handling them, doing behavioral experiments, doing neurosurgery stuff. Um, and then I started to learn about how computational neuroscience is used within the field. And part of the one of the big draws for me was that it felt like with the computational models, you can actually start explaining how things work. Whereas the experimental data collection, it's you're getting a description, you're collecting data to say like this is what happens, this is the activity of these neurons. But the work of actually piecing all that together to describe how a system works in full I was a little bit more interested in that side of it, of yeah, piecing things together and making these mechanistic models of like you're really trying to say, I think this behavior emerges because this neuron is connected to that neuron and whatever. So that was a big motivator for why I wanted to do computational modeling because it felt like it had that power of synthesizing across different experimental results. And then, the lifestyle is a little bit better because yeah, you can work from anywhere for the most part, and you can, at least when I was younger, I could work from anywhere. Now I have teaching and other responsibilities.
Ugh,
But
bureaucracy.
and yeah, and you can pivot a little bit easier to some extent too, because it's not like you build a whole physical lab to do a certain type of experiment and then you want to do a different type and you have to get new equipment and whatever. There's a little bit more flexibility as a computational person as well.
Awesome. Okay. Now is the moment that everybody's been waiting for. Do you have any advice for me?
Um, okay, advice for you. I mean, one, I would say, keep on being curious about so many things. That'll go far. And I would also say, in general, something that I think serves people well is to be clear-headed about how things work.
Oh,
And that's very
you just
general,
you
but,
just cut out.
oops,
The
was
last
that
thing you said was be clear-headed.
yes, be clear-headed about how things work. I think sometimes people this applies in, like, social settings about knowing, like, um if you are, trying to test, authority figures in some way, like, know what actually matters in that. It applies to how the world works, like, scientifically. As I was talking about, like, mechanistic models, how do things actually work? What are the relevant parts that matter for the outcome? All of these this it's a general principle that I think I am kind of naturally biased towards this very mechanistic mindset of how does this system work? And I think that has helped me, and sometimes if I forget to be that way, if I try to be more that way, it helps me. And so I think it's good general advice to just really try to figure out how whatever thing that you're doing, whatever you're a part of, how does it actually work? And then you'll be able to do more things within that system.
Wonderful. Thank you.
Mm.
Thank you for coming on this podcast. I have enjoyed talking about neuroscience with you. Of
Yeah, thanks for having me.
course.